Electoral College. And it was 6 weeks. So I went, was it 4 weeks? Well, whatever, it was a long time.
It seemed like a lot.
But I went to him and I said, can you condense that to about 30 minutes? And he said, well, I might be able to. So he's going to condense a whole lot of information, but he still will be very thorough because I know him. And we will still have time for questions. If you don't get all your questions answered at 6:30, we don't have to exit the restaurant. We just have to exit the room. And we'll go in there and keep answering. So don't worry about it. You can keep drinking and eating and whatever you want to do. But let me tell you a little bit about him. And one other thing I want to share with you. In this room, there's 2 petitions. One is a Montgomery County petition, one is a Greene County petition. They're marked. And what they are, it's to sign to get universal background checks on the ballot. Even though they're talking in the State House, they're talking at the federal level, we are not sure that that's going to really result in anything. So just in case, we're getting our signatures, and that's our fail-safe method to get it on the ballot and all else falls apart. Okay? So that's in there. Make sure you sign before you leave. I will pick it up and carry it in there with this in. But Tim spent his career as a self-employed communication and business development consultant, coach, and facilitator for professional service firms, focusing on the legal profession as well as an audiovisual writer, producer, director of corporate programs and conferences. Since 2005, he's been actively involved with the UDLLI, where he's conducted 33 seminars. Is that all? I've taken your time.
I thought I took 30 more.
Oh, we don't want you here now.
On American history topics, he's facilitated discussion groups covering economic, social, and cultural issues. He's past president of the Board of Advisors and currently a consultant to the board. He holds BA and MA degrees in communication from UD. For 5 years, in addition to his consulting business, he was an adjunct professor in the MBA program at Miami University of Ohio. He lieutenant in the U.S. Army Signal Corps, served as Division Total Officer in Vietnam. So, no flashbacks. Okay, all righty. Topic today, what history teaches us about the Electoral College. Welcome to all of you. We're so glad you're here, and I'm sure you will leave knowing more than you have come.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I have a couple of questions for you. Hi, Mike. First question, how many political parties were on the ballot in 2016 election? Anybody know? Any more? 62. Not in all states. Not in all states. 62. Okay. Second question. Throughout our history, there have been several proposals to abolish the Electoral College. How many do you think there have been? Give me a guess. How many? Take a guess. How many? 2, 3? Over 700. And we still haven't done it. What can I tell you? Okay, what were the 5 elections where the winner lost a popular vote but won the Electoral College? What 5 elections? Anybody know? What is it? Five. Which ones? Okay, very quickly. 2, the first one was in the 1824 election with John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. By the way, they were both Democratic Republicans. Okay. 1876 with Rutherford B. Hayes and Tilden from New York, who was a Democrat. The 1888 election with Benjamin Harrison versus Grover Cleveland. Remember, Grover Cleveland had 2 non-consecutive terms as president, all right? And of course, we know 2000 and also 2016. As Valerie mentioned, this is boiled down from a 3-week lecture. I'm boiling it down to about 30 minutes. So I'm going to talk really fast because I want to get everything in. Okay? So I want to hit about three things I want to talk to you about. And one is the constitutional background and the kind of the early history. How did this whole thing come about? Second thing we'll get into is some of the Electoral College issues that we have and we've experienced. And the third one, I'll kind of give an update on the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. You all know what the compact is? If you don't, we're going to talk about it. All right. So, Electoral College, we have what? How many? 538 electoral votes. Is that correct? 538. 435 from the House, 100 from the Senate, and what? Washington, D.C. gets 3. As of, according to the 23rd Amendment in 1961. All right? How many, there are, and what Washington, D.C. gets is they get the same number of electoral votes as the smallest states. There are 7 states that only have 3 electoral votes. Anybody can name them? No? No? Okay, Wyoming, Alaska, Delaware, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming. Okay? Now, U.S. territories, they have representation in Congress, but only in committees. They can't vote on the House floor. But the U.S. territories, we have over 4 million U.S. citizens who live in U.S. territories who cannot vote for the president. The U.S. territories have no electoral votes. Is that fair? No. Okay. All right. Huh? They pay taxes, of course. And they have all the other rights of American citizens. Now, let's go back to 1787. Get in your time machine. We're going back to 1787. So what happened was, the Revolutionary War is over in 1783 with the Treaty of Paris. We settled it with England. And we still have, and the Articles of Confederation, that particular, our first Constitution, which was only ratified in 1781, almost when time the war was over with, it was totally unwieldy. All right? To get anything done, everybody had to agree unanimously. Imagine politicians agreeing unanimously, or not. So they all get, about 1787, they get together and they say, we got to fix this. So the idea was to fix the Articles of Confederation. They got to talking about it, they said, this is crazy because we can't fix this. So they come up with this whole new Constitution, all right? And one of the first things that they did in this Constitution, convention, was the state of Virginia, they happened to come prepared with a plan. And one of the parts of the Virginia plan was to say that the President of the United States should be elected by Congress. All right? Because people in Congress will elect the President. That was the plan. And about 9 states out of the 13, or actually 12 who were there at the convention, said, that sounds like a good idea. But then they threw it into committee. They thought, well, we've got to refine this. So the committee comes back and says, no, we can't have Congress do this because Congress, that's too political. That's too close to the president. So what we'll do is we'll come up with electors, white men, of course, white propertied men, who will say, they'll be independent, and every state will have the number of electors that state has representatives and their 2 senators. All right? That's where the electors come from. And so what happens is, everybody says, well, okay, we can agree with that. And they say, because this way it'd be non-political. We wouldn't have Congress doing it, right? So it's not political at all. So, and also what they did, they gave it to the states the power to decide how to select electors. It's not written in the Constitution. The states decide, okay? The states could say, okay, we're going to have our legislature vote, or not, we're going to pick the electors. Whether you do is pick them or we'll vote for them, all right? Or they decided, they say, well, let's put it out to the population and say, let them vote for the electors, right? Which is pretty much what's done now. And that's how we'll decide. So it's all left up to the states. And frankly, the convention, the Constitutional Convention, they didn't feel that the people were smart enough, educated enough to determine who should be president. Okay? They wanted smart people. Well, also you have to remember this. You have a time with not much mass communications. You had newspapers, which were very slow to move around. You had the mail. That was it. So we don't have instantaneous communications here. And they figure, well, you know what? People aren't really going to be educated. If I'm in Georgia, what do I know about the guy from New York who's running for president? I can't. I am the volume. So, all right. So that's one of the things they figured out, that we can't trust the populace to do a direct election. Southern states felt that, wait a minute, we're going to be cheated here because our slaves can't vote. And so our slaves can't vote, so we come up with what? The 3/5 compromise, right? So John Rutledge out of South Carolina, he's the one who proposes it, and he says, okay, the 3/5 compromise says that all slaves will be counted as 3/5 of a person. And of course, what that did was create the slaveholders who were all the presidents in the first half of the 19th century until the Civil War, essentially, all right? Okay, so the founders made some assumptions. And one of their assumptions was that electors, the people would come up with the electoral vote, that it would be done by district, congressional district, not winner take all. So you know what I'm saying? In other words, if a candidate wins the most votes in a particular district, that electoral vote would go to that candidate. So you might not have all the districts to that one candidate in a state. But what happened was they started using the winner-take-all concept. In other words, whoever wins, okay, the popular vote in that state will win the electoral votes. They also then figured that the candidates would pair up as president and vice president. They didn't think about that. So it's designed, they figured the system was also designed that the majority of time the election would end up being in a tie, and it would go to the House to determine. So if the president's in a tie vote, electoral vote, it goes to the House, then each state has a vote. So in this case, you'd have to have a simple majority. 26 states would have to vote for that one person, all right? If it's a tie with the vice president, it goes to the Senate. But each senator gets a vote. That's just the way they figured it out. So Alexander Hamilton, who's one of the architects of the Electoral College, he figures that, number one, these electors would come directly from the people. They would also be gathered together for one purpose and one time only. So they wouldn't be tainted, wouldn't be politicians. All right? And they'd also vote their individual conscience. So the idea of elector, the whole point with the elector was you get somebody who's intelligent enough, who knows what's going on, and says, I think this candidate should be president because for whatever reasons. The fact that they are the best. I vote my conscience on this, all right? That was the idea. All right, so the other thing is that Hamilton thought was a good idea. They're going to meet in the state capitol, which they do, to cast their votes. And all states meet at the same time. So there's not going to be any hanky-panky with, one state meets on this week and next one meets next week, and they say, well, how did you guys vote? That kind of thing. Okay, so it's all at one time. And the other thing is to consider is that even today, you can't have any federal office holder being an elector, okay? Which is the same today. So that's what they figured. So what happened? Well, even before the third presidential election in 1796, the thing stopped working. All right? Partisan politics moves in. The point was that the Congress, or the convention, they never figured on political parties. Which is really kind of suspect, because actually even in 1789, we had pro-administration parties and you had anti-administration parties. Already those factions were forming. The first political parties were formed in 1792, the second election. You had the Federalists under John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, and you had the Republicans, not today's Republicans, under Jefferson and Madison. So what happens is the privilege of serving as an elector would typically be awarded not to leading citizens willing to express their independent judgments, which was the idea, but basically framers, they may have assumed, but the party, loyalists, and usually minor ones at that. So it became parties. So those became the electors. Now it becomes totally partisan, which is totally the opposite of what the intention was. All right? So the slate of electors chosen by the state were no longer free agents, no longer independent thinkers. Right? So Madison and Hamilton, they see this happening right away, and they're trying to tell people, hey, this is not the spirit of the Constitution. This is not what we intended. So Hamilton even goes so far as to write a draft, an amendment to the Constitution to at least say the district method should be used in selecting a president. Okay? And again, a district method would be a more accurate method than just winner take all, right? Well, that went nowhere. Either he didn't try hard enough, or everybody says, forget it, we're not doing it. All right, so the question to you is can the Electoral College be considered legitimate today based on the Constitution's original intent? What do you think? I know I'm talking to a very biased audience. I understand that. But you know, when I first started doing research, when I did that 3-week course, and I kept a very open mind for all the way through it. And I still wasn't sure after I put everything together how I felt about it. But after doing more and more research and then boiling it down to what I'm talking to you about tonight is, it's a no-brainer. We don't need it. It's not intended, it's not being used the way it was intended. Okay, so why did the system jam up so soon? Well, you know, one version says that the founders' clever contraption for counting votes in order to counterbalance the large and the small states. You've heard that argument, right? Okay. All right, so if that was the case, why over the almost 250 years of our republic, we've only had 3 presidents that came from considered small states? Zachary Taylor from Louisiana, Franklin Pierce from New Hampshire, and Bill Clinton from Arkansas. So where's the small state thing help? Doesn't, all right? Another version said the framers abhorred democracy. They were somewhat concerned about do the people have enough information? Are they educated enough to be able to vote, which is a consideration. And if that was the case, why did they let the states say, okay, we'll elect our electors by popular vote? Well, that's direct democracy, right? Why didn't they just say, we'll have all the people vote directly for the president? Good question. All right, so things really start to fall apart in 1796, and that's when we have the John Adams, who's a Federalist. He gets the majority of electoral votes, but the rest of the Federalists scattered their votes among several other candidates, and what happened was Thomas Jefferson from the other party, the Republicans, Jefferson's Republicans, he gets the next number of votes. All right? So so what happens is the part of the problem is the Federalist electors scattered their votes, and part of the problem is that they cast 2 votes for president. That was how the thing reads, right? You cast 2 votes for presidents. Okay, so even before, and then what happens is, obviously John Adams is president, and he gets Thomas Jefferson is vice president from 2 different parties, and they're like this for the entire administration, right? Okay. They became better friends later on, but they corresponded. But what happens was before Adams even was inaugurated, a guy by the name of William Smith, who's a Federalist out of South Carolina, said, hey, wait a minute, I got an idea. He throws a resolution into the House and says, why don't we do this? Why don't we require each elector to cast 1 vote for president and 1 vote for vice president? Then we won't have this mess. Duh, right? It's pretty simple. And he was ignored. So the 1800 election, the very next election, comes back to bite him because of that, all right? So what happens was Thomas Jefferson gets the most, or actually ties with Aaron Burr, okay, for president, and it goes into the House. And eventually, for a lot of reasons, Jefferson wins, which was the Republicans really wanted Jefferson as president and then Burr as vice president, okay? So finally, they should have listened to Bill Smith before, and they finally come up with the 12th Amendment that basically says we're going to have every elector is going to vote for a president and a vice president position. So we separate it. Very simple, right? Okay, so they do that. And that's what we've been doing ever since. Now let's look at some other issues. Congressional district winner, a congressional district, and then a winner take all. Now there are 2 states that use the congressional district method. You know what they are? Who they are? Maine and Nebraska. Okay? Now, Maine only has 4 electoral votes, Nebraska has 5, so it doesn't make that much difference. And actually, I think the first time they actually split was in 2008. I think Nebraska gave Obama 1 district, and I think McCain got another or something like that. So, but even as far back as 1789, the very first election, Pennsylvania and Maryland did winner take all. All right?
Say that again.
Winner take all, not the congressional district method, all right? But beginning about 1804, things start to change, and everybody starts shifting over to winner take all. All right? By 1836, the district method totally falls out of favor. Okay? So it becomes more and more skewed. In 1832, only South Carolina was having the state legislature select the electors. They weren't even doing it by popular vote. All right? So by 1836 to the rest of the 19th century until Maine in 1972, switched to the district method, and then in 1996, Nebraska did. All right, they switched. Now, remember this. There's been instances where the legislature is trying to switch back and forth. There's been some instances in Nebraska and so on a few years ago where they wanted to switch back to winner take all and so on. So remember, the state legislatures can change their mind anytime and say, we're going to go back to this, we're going to do this. We can do anything we want, essentially, all right? So if you think about the winner take all thing, they're saying if you got a candidate who said, well, you know what, that's a red state, it's so sewed up, I'm not even going to campaign there. 2016, Hillary Clinton never campaigned in California or New York, 2 of our largest states. Why? There was no need to. We had that sewed up. We're going to concentrate what? With the Electoral College, you end up concentrating on about 4 or 5 swing states. All right? So, you've heard a question about small states and large states. We thought about the idea, but what about the small states? The large states will, overpower them. And the fact that, Wyoming, your vote theoretically counts more in Wyoming than it does in California because of the population. All right? So it's basically a try to defend the idea on the grounds that the small states need and are entitled to protection from the large states. For what? From what? All right? What protection? What does it have to do with anything is the question. And so why should the interest of voters in small states be entitled to extra protection? Shouldn't those entitled to extra protection in the states be people who are in need, as opposed to just the fact you have to live in a small state, like Vermont or Wyoming or whatever, right, population-wise, right? So if you have a popular vote with no electoral college, would the legitimate rights and interests of citizens in the small states suffer from neglect or abuse? Well, of course not. Your vote would be the same whether it's in the middle of Wyoming or in the middle of Manhattan. It's very simple. Let's talk about the popular vote and the electoral vote. So the system of direct popular election, where every citizen's vote is given equal weight. This is, one person, one vote idea. Very important. Presidential candidates will even be more eager to go where their possible votes are. All right? So a lot of people who say, well, the Electoral College, people will go everywhere. Well, they don't. That's the whole point. They only go to about 5 or 6 states. All right? So parties would have a strong incentive to increase the turnout everywhere, not just in swing states. That's where all the money is spent. That's where all the activity is. Right? Now, one of the, if parties really want to get the votes, what they really need to do is make sure their party platform reaches a lot more people. Very simple. So, currently the national popular vote is irrelevant under the Electoral College. We know that. It doesn't really make any difference. It's crazy. Why should we vote? And a lot of people think that way. Why should I go to the polls? My state never votes the way I would vote. Is my vote worth it? No.
Yes.
That's what they think. Okay, here's something else. 4 out of 5 voters in a national election are absolutely ignored. 2012, there are 253 general election campaign events were in just 12 states. And 2/3 of those events were in just 4 states. 38 states were completely ignored. According to fairvote.org, in 2004 election, candidates devoted 3/4 of their campaign resources to just 5 states. That's it. 45 states received very little attention. 18 states had no candidate visits and no TV advertising. So important swing states issues receive more attention.
Where are those states I want to be?
Yeah. Okay, you want to move to Wyoming is where you want to go. By the way, technically it is technically possible to win 270 electoral votes with only 22% of the popular vote. Okay? All right. So, the closest we have come of those 700 proposals to change the Electoral College, the closest we came was back in the 1969-71 period, where what happened was Representative Emanuel Seller out of New York, who was also happened to be the chairman of the Judiciary Committee at the time, he puts forth a resolution on the floor, 681, that says we should just use the popular vote, and provided that the candidate won at least 40% of the popular vote. If they didn't win 40%, it was split because you have other parties or whatever it might be, then you have a runoff election, which most countries, all countries really do. They might do a runoff. All right? So the House passes this resolution 339 to 70. It's very bipartisan. That was a period when we were still pretty bipartisan, frankly. So the resolution passed the House. So a week after that, President Nixon, he comes out and he supports the idea of abolishing the Electoral College. And he recommends that the Senate pass their resolution, which was Birch Bayh, who's a Democrat from Indiana, the senator, proposed. And so this thing goes in a committee, it's sitting in a committee for almost a year. And by August of 1970, the Senate Judiciary Committee sent its report advocating passage of the proposal to the full Senate. All right? So this is getting closer. Now remember, what happens is to get an amendment out there into the states, the House and the Senate both has to pass it with 2/3 majority. It doesn't go to the president for signature. It bypasses the president, goes directly to the states. And then the states, of course, vote, and you have to have 3/4, which is 38 states in this case, to approve it. So, the proposal, what happened was, so in September of 70, the Senate started debate, and it's quickly filibustered. And mostly by Southern senators and conservatives from small states, both Democrats and Republicans, who argued abolishing the Electoral College would reduce their state's political influence. How? But nobody really asked that question and said, how? It doesn't, all right? So, so there were a couple of moves for cloture, stop the filibuster, and it didn't work. So Senator, who was the Senate Majority Leader at the time, Mike Mansfield, if you remember, from Montana, he puts it aside to do other Senate business, and it dies at the end of January of 1971. That was the closest we came, all right? And the other thing is that what happened was Bai said that the Senate probably needed only like 10 or 12 votes to get that 67 2/3. And he asked Nixon to, kind of cajole the Republican senators to do something. And Nixon didn't renege on his initial idea, but he ignored it. So if Nixon would have promoted that and said, yeah, let's get out there to the Senate, it probably would have passed. And there's a good chance because the people throughout our history have wanted that dropped, the abolition of the Electoral College. Okay. 2017, Senator Steve Cohen, Democrat from Tennessee, puts the resolution on the floor of the House to have a popular vote instead of electoral vote. Except the only difference is whoever wins the popular vote, period, no matter what the percentage is, that's the one who's elected. So it doesn't have that plurality idea that the Bai-Seller Amendment had. And that's, of course, still, it went nowhere. It's still sitting out there. Nothing's happened. March of 2018, Pew Research Center poll showed that 55% of Americans supported and 41% opposed replacing the Electoral College with a national popular vote. That was 75% Democrats were for, 32% of Republicans were for. They wanted to replace the Electoral College. Okay, quick note on faithless. By the way, in other periods of time, I think it was like 81% of the population in this country in 1968 wanted it replaced, wanted it abolished. So it's always been a little bit majority, but not, again, it was only in, for example, right after the 2016 election, 47% of Americans wanted to keep the Electoral College, 49% wanted to get rid of it. Okay, so that was really one of the closest times when pretty much even. So let me say something about faithless electors. You've heard of the idea of faithless electors, who are the ones who don't vote for who they pledge to. In other words, okay, so what happens is basically they ignore their party and vote for somebody else, either the other candidate or someone else totally who's not even on the ballot, all right? Some states have laws against this, but none have really been enforced. And frankly, they couldn't stand up to a court case if you look at the Constitution. There's no such thing as a faithless elector if you look at the Constitution. You're supposed to vote your conscience, not who your party said you should vote for. Okay? So, by the way, no faithless electors have ever come close to changing an election. It's a moot point, all right? In 2016, we had 7 faithless electors, and I think that was the most we've ever had in almost any election. So it's kind of an irrelevant thing. 5 deserted Clinton and 2 defected from Trump. And 2, I think, who defected from Trump, one voted for Kasich, and the other one voted for Colin Powell. Neither of them on the ballot, all right? I'm sorry?
The defectors, who did they vote for?
Oh, I don't know. I don't remember. That's too hard of a question. I can't answer it. Don't ask me any more hard questions. Okay, so the point is the faithless elector, that's a person just voting their conscience. That's the whole point, right? And that's what the Constitution says they're supposed to do. All right. Third thing I want to mention. You've heard, how many have heard of the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact? Okay. All right, essentially, in 2006, this group comes up with this idea that if they can go to all the states, as many states as they can, to get the state legislatures to pass the idea that whoever wins the national popular vote gets the electoral votes for that state. Okay? Makes sense, right? And remember, every state decides how they're going to do this. So, first of all, Electoral College, as we say, it discourages the voter turnout, and it leaves the emphasis on only a few states, while a popular election would equalize voting power. That's what we're talking about, right? So, the compact would benefit neither party. Matter of fact, traditionally in our parties, the Republicans and Democrats have won pretty much almost 50-50 as far as the number of elections. All right. It's based on the Constitution, which says that each state legislature can determine how you come up with electors. All right. So therefore, the vote, the legislatures can vote for the compact, and so as of July of this year, 15 states, all blue in this case, plus the District of Columbia, have voted for the compact, meaning they would pledge their electoral votes to whoever won the national popular vote. All right. Now they have that those states and the District of Columbia, three electoral votes. That comes to a total of 196 electoral votes. So they need to get up to 270. If they can get enough states that would total 270, then you'd have it, right? Okay. Now, that's when the thing would go into effect. So anyhow, this would be in lieu of passing a constitutional amendment to abolish the Electoral College, right? However, if you think about it, according to the Constitution, as I just said, any state legislature at any time can change their mind on how they want to come up with electors. So if you have a state that says, okay, we're with the compact, and the next group of legislators come in and say, oh, we don't like that idea, let's go back to winner take all right? So the only way that you're really going to get this thing working is if you pass a constitutional amendment to be safe, all right? But it's a start. And even a lot of scholars will say, well, if I don't know, they think that Congress has to approve if they pass the compact, you're going to have court cases. They figure that Congress has to approve it. No, it doesn't, not according to the Constitution, because that's a state issue. It's not a federal issue, all right? So, because the states have the power to decide. So, best way to do it is a constitutional amendment, all right? There are the 15, anybody know what the 15 states are? I can tell you what the 15 states are. Maryland, New Jersey, Illinois, Hawaii, Washington, Massachusetts, Vermont, California, Rhode Island, New York, Connecticut, Colorado, Delaware, New Mexico, and Oregon, and of course the District of Columbia. That's where we are. So, what are your thoughts on all this?
I have a question.
Yes.
What do you think that those 15 states have in common? Because that seemed like a strange combination.
Well, they're blue states.
Right.
But the point is, even if it's a red, what difference does it make?
Right.
Because that's the point. It's a pretty simple process. We are the only country in the world where the leader of that country doesn't have to have the most votes to get elected. How democratic is that?
So if I understand it correct, because the Electoral College, as it works now, basically suppresses people voting, the party that would have an interest in maintaining the electoral college is the party that is more likely to be in the minority. Okay, and we know what that party is. So the Republican Party is going to work very, very hard. They do not like the popular vote, so they're going to work very, very hard to maintain the electoral college. Am I making I mean, there's a self-interest there. I mean, whether it's right or wrong, that's where.
You have to remember too, Republicans are, their base is more rural, Democrats are more urban. Let me give you another quick little thing. In 1920 census, okay, that's when we first found that there were more people living in urban areas than there were in rural areas, all right? That was the year Republicans were in charge of Congress, and that was the only year they didn't follow the Constitution and say, we have to reapportion based on the census. Because most of the support for Republicans came from rural areas. So they go through the whole 1920s, they're mostly in control of Congress throughout the whole 1920s. Not until the 1930 census did they finally reapportion. So that's some of the same reasons.
Is there any hope that it can be abolished?
I think there is. The majority of people, and it keeps on going up, if people learn this, if people say, wait a minute, we have to put the pressure on. So there's still hope when you say, write your congressperson, be active, and you get the fact that you're here and the group that you belong to says you're active. And by the way, let me mention this, as you all know this, that in 1970, when that period we came so close to getting rid of it, what happened? That was the year the League of Women Voters passed a resolution to abolish the Electoral College, right?
Paul, there's an option, there's more options than just abolish the electoral college with the popular vote or the electoral college. And one of them is, and then take a constitutional amendment, is basically to increase the number of people in the House of Representatives, which changes the electoral competition and makes it more popular.
Okay, that's a good point. You can there's millions of ways to do this. I did a simple, but let me mention something about that. If we went according to the Constitution originally, Constitution says every representative will represent 30,000 people. Then in 1792, Congress says let's make it 33,000. You know, they were very generous. Okay. So, but in 1911, they passed the Apportionment Act that puts a cap on it, and they pretty much solidified that with the 1929 Reapportionment Act. And if we did not have that cap, the population today, we would have 10,932 representatives, which I'm sure we get a lot done. But you're absolutely right. You could change it, and yet gerrymandering is the other problem as well. There's no doubt. So it's very, very complex. Yes.
So say the Democratic Party would like to do that. Do they have it in their platform?
I don't think they do.
Abolish the electoral college? Do what?
I don't think they do. The Democratic Party have that in their platform. They're not thinking about that.
I was going to say, we all assume that the popular vote is the popular vote, and the consequence of going to a direct election, there are other politicians. So I can figure out how to get around it. Well, what I do, campaigning is mostly immediate. So think of what that's going to do to dirty money and a campaign. It will actually increase. Because now, instead of just focusing on 5 or 6 states, you have to campaign in California, where the media cost is much greater. And you may make choices about it's easier to reach more swing voters in LA than it is in Wyoming by one commercial. So now you're going to have an election that's going to cost $10 billion as opposed to $1 billion. So we have to think about what the consequence is of just going from one
if you go from, you're talking about those consequences, you also have to think about what's the consequences of democracy, what's fair when it comes to voting. And the simple thing is, it's wherever the chips may fall based on one person, one vote. My vote in Wyoming, if you go national popular vote, is the same as in the populated area in LA. Okay? So whatever happens. And so one side says, hey, you know what, if the Electoral College helps spread it out. Well, it doesn't at all. You only focus on a couple of swing states. So with a popular vote, it would force you to go to some other places too. So there are trade-offs, but the point is, what the bottom line is, what's the most democratic?
Campaign finance reform.
Well, that's a,
Yes, sir. The problem with the question of what's most democratic is we are not a democracy.
well, we're a republic. And that's, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And the other thing is, thinking about it, they talked about, the founding fathers were thinking of the fact that you have electors would be voted by the populace. They felt that was pretty much of a republic idea. So I thought that was a good idea. Yeah. Well, a true democracy, I mean, it would never work. I mean, you'd have a hell of a time with just the people in this room with a true democracy.